During the 100 Years' War between the English and the French from 1337 to 1453, the arms and armour used were fairly similar for each army. The two kingdoms shared a lot of culture and traditions, and as such the knightly armour was also quite similar. Firstly, I encourage you all to follow the reenactor in the video on his social media pages, linked in the video description. Aymeric is from the French reenactment group Gendarme, who specialises in early 15th century history and provides excellent reconstructions of arms and armour from this period. The knight squire puts on the sabatons, or solerettes. This is metal armour which goes over the turn shoes. The leather turn shoes themselves are specifically made with armour in mind, featuring a pair of laces to tie the tips of the sabatons to the shoe to prevent them from flapping around during movement. Next, the leg harness is worn. By the beginning of the 15th century, fully enclosed greaves were now commonplace for knights and professional soldiers. Italian blast furnaces were beginning to make bespoke armour on an industrial scale, and hence began the export market for arms and armour. The entire leg harness is made up of greaves to protect the lower leg, articulated pollaines to protect the knee, and a cuisse to protect the upper leg. These cuisses are made in a typical English style, in which the articulated plates go all the way around the upper leg, protecting the back of the thigh where the vulnerable artery would usually be at risk. This is typical of an English harness, as the English knights famously preferred dismounted combat since the defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where the English realised that mounted knights were not as invincible as they previously thought, so new tactics had to be invented. During this time, the French were still mostly relying on mounted knightly combat, with powerful charges with the lance to break through enemy lines with extreme force. But as the 100 Years' War raged on, the French also began to adopt some English tactics. Again, despite this being a French knight, we see some beautiful brass decoration on the edges of the leg harness, which is a typical English style, further suggesting that various styles were adopted between the two kingdoms. Leg harnesses are generally one of the most difficult pieces of armour to wear. They are made up of many components which must articulate perfectly with the wearer's leg, or else they fail to function properly and can be a hindrance on the battlefield. All the straps must be checked by both the knight and the squire to ensure a tight fit without restricting movement. All throughout the medieval period, mail was vital in armouring. During the 11th to 13th centuries, mail was the main component of armour, but as plate began to protect the body more, mail became a secondary level of defence, reserved mostly for protecting the gaps between the plates of armour and offering two layers of protection. Here a mail collar is worn, which consists of 6mm riveted flattened rings. These provide excellent coverage whilst remaining flexible, resting comfortably on the wearer's shoulders. A leather edging at the top provides comfort to the knight when the mail is protecting the throat. Brass, tinned, or even gilded links also provide an extra level of status to the look, showing that the knight is wealthy and a serious warrior. A mail shirt with silk inner lining is worn over the torso, with each link riveted closed, to prevent them from pulling apart. As mentioned before, the mail shirt provided a second layer of protection, since a plate cuirass will be worn over the top. Although exceedingly rare, an arrow from a longbow could puncture through plate armour if it hit the plate at a direct angle with full power. However, as soon as the arrowhead punctured the plate, it would lose all its power instantly, so the mail would act as a final barrier to stop any part of the arrowhead from reaching the flesh. But this is a 1 in a million chance anyway. The most important parts of the mail shirt were the arms to protect the shoulders and armpits, as well as the crotch. Interestingly, here you can see an additional mail flap which is worn similar to a diaper to protect the groin. Evidence of this is seen in contemporary artwork, with a few methods being suggested throughout the 15th century, such as from mail skirts and also mail shorts, although this seems to be a much later 15th century technique, as we lack evidence to suggest that those unique mail components were worn in the early half of the 15th century. The squire now assists the knight with wearing his arm harness. Similar to the legs, the arm harness is made up of multiple articulating components and are a highly technical piece of armour to make and wear. The three main parts are the vambraces, or lower cannon, which is fully enclosed around the forearm, the cutter, which protects the elbow, and the rerebrace, or upper cannon, which protects the upper arm. Again, just like the leg harness, the rerebrace is fully enclosed, which is a typical English style, as additional protection is more important in dismounted combat as opposed to fighting on horseback. During the early 15th century, the shoulder protection was often integrated with the arm harness to act as one singular item. These are called spolders, and they protect the shoulders, and are also articulated with multiple lanes of steel, often on sliding rivets, to provide exceedingly good mobility. From the 1430s onwards, larger plates begin to be used to protect the shoulders, called pauldrons, and these provided much more protection but with a slight loss of mobility. Often, pauldrons were reserved for mounted knights where most of your combat involved couching a lance and puncturing into an enemy line, so additional movement wasn't as necessary. Dismounted units were often using two-handed polearms, so additional movement was more important than a higher level of protection. With medieval armour, there is always a trade-off between mobility and protection. The first part of the cuirass to be worn are the folds. This is essentially a skirt made up of multiple lanes of steel all overlapping each other. The folds are hinged on one side and strapped on the other. An additional triangle of steel plates over the groin protects this vulnerable area. Next, the breastplate protects the torso and goes over the mail shirt. The squire has to ensure that the breast and back plate is tightly fitted to the body, so he squeezes everything in place before tightening the straps, with the knight confirming that he still feels comfortable. The breastplate features a mount on the frontal right-hand side. This would allow for an arret to be added, which is a small metal arm to rest a lance, allowing for a more accurate and impactful strike during a mounted charge. As today this knight is dismounted, he does not require the arret to be fixed to the breastplate. The breastplate also features a buckle on both the front and the back. This will be used later when the helmet is worn. As previously mentioned regarding the shoulders, pauldrons weren't invented yet, so spolders and mail were the typical protection for this part of the body. To provide additional protection, small rectangular plates called besigues were tied to the mail shirt and covered the vulnerable area of the armpits. The armpits are a very difficult part of the body to protect, as they require a lot of freedom of movement, so can't just be covered in plate armour. Although later in the 16th century, armouring technology excelled so much that tiny articulated plates were riveted together to protect even the most vulnerable parts of the body, such as the armpits, inner elbows, back of the knees, and the groin. Hourglass gauntlets are worn to protect the hands, which are a typical style of the 15th century, named as such for their shape is similar to an hourglass. Now that the knight is almost fully armoured, his squire fetches his sword belt. An arming sword is attached to the belt via a scabbard, as well as a typical 15th century dagger called a rondel. While swords weren't commonly used by knights on a 15th century battlefield, as they aren't particularly useful against a fully armoured opponent knight, they are still seen as a status symbol of knightly power, and there are some theories that swords were considered a religious item and may have been worn onto the battlefield for superstitious religious beliefs as well as being a status symbol. A typical French and English style of helmet in the early 15th century was the bassinet. This is a form of head protection which curves around the shape of the head to provide a close fit as well as excellent protection, with a padded layer inside to help increase comfort but also lessen the effects of head trauma such as concussion. The type of bassinet you see here is called a great bassinet. Great bassinets were developed in around 1410 and remained in use right up until the 1440s and possibly even later. Most bassinets consist of a male neck and shoulder protection called an aventail, but great bassinets replaced this male component with a solid plate, which was then strapped into place by the buckles on the breast and back plates of the cuirass. Great bassinets were designed to sit on the shoulders, not the head. So the wearer's head is actually not bearing any of the weight of the helmet, which means that they do not get immediately impacted by blunt force trauma against the helmet from an incoming attack. This ingenious design was also common in early 15th century jousting helmets, most famously the frogmouth. Lance strikes, whether in jousting or field combat, were becoming far more powerful largely thanks to the invention of the arret, meaning a single well-aimed lance strike could easily snap the neck of the opponent upon impact. These designs of helmets helped minimize this risk. The helmet also features a visor which can be kept open for additional vision, or lowered to provide excellent protection against incoming arrow fire, which was always a big danger on battlefields during the 15th century. Also during the 15th century, shields were still commonplace on the battlefield, but were often reserved for lower class soldiers who used them as cheaper alternatives to plate armour. But smaller shields like this were still popular for knights, especially for mounted combat. This shield is called a targe, and is strapped to the knight with the use of multiple straps and buckles. Unlike most shields in previous periods of history, targes stayed fastened to the knight's shoulder, pretty much acting as an additional layer of armour. This was because most people were right-handed, so they took most of their hits from opponents on the left side of their body. Targes provided blanket protection for the left shoulder and arm, which was one of the most common places to get hit. The targe would absorb the majority of the power from incoming strikes from lances, poleaxes, and other heavy weapons, as even if armour protects parts of your body, you can still receive broken bones and internal bleeding from taking repeated heavy hits on the battlefield. Targes were often painted in beautiful artistic designs and heraldry, likely making it easy for other knights and military commanders to identify them on the battlefield, so they know where everybody was during chaotic engagements. Finally, the squire hands the knight his primary weapon, the poleaxe. Although sounding very similar to a pole axe, the poleaxe appears to be a specific weapon reserved for knightly combat. They often featured 2 or 3 components at the business end, such as a spike and an axe head, but also often featured hammerheads, quartered spikes, spearheads, or curved spikes called crowbeaks if you're English, or bec de corbin if you're French. The poleaxe was a primary weapon that the knight would practice with, learning how to utilise the various instruments at the end to debilitate or even disarm the opponent, expertly getting the spike in between the plates of armour, or using the axe or hammer to force the opponent to the floor, giving the knight vital seconds to pin him down and dispatch him with the rondel dagger.